On a sunny afternoon, in a small neighborhood of the town of Rivetville, two young friends, Liam and Ethan, were having fun on a local soccer field, their little sanctuary where the concerns of the world seemed to have no grip. The golden rays of the sun filtered through the leaves of the trees, casting dancing shadows on the ground. At 13, Liam, tall and lean, moved with natural grace, his agile body seeming to defy gravity. His speed and skill allowed him to easily dribble past his imaginary opponents, while Ethan, a bit more stocky but just as athletic, confidently kept up with him in their passing exchanges. Their laughter echoed through the park, a joyful sound that caught the attention of passers-by. They ran tirelessly, their voices rising like a playful melody, sharing jokes and challenges with each pass. In this world of innocence, they threw the ball to each other with such fervor that even the noise of the city seemed to fade around them. The surface of the field, though often rough and worn, was to them a playground without limits where imagination took precedence over reality. In the house across the street, a middle-aged woman, Mrs. Bernard, watched the scene with a disapproving look. With the curtains of her window slightly parted, her sharp eyes followed each movement of the boys, as if scrutinizing every detail of their game. She didn't like seeing them play there, disturbing the calm she cherished so much in this peaceful neighborhood. To her, every burst of laughter was an intrusion into the tranquility she had carefully cultivated over the years. "This neighborhood is losing its value with this kind of disorder," she muttered irritably, her brows furrowed as she rubbed her hands, as if merely observing them could influence the course of events. The boys, oblivious to her displeasure, continued playing, their loud laughter filling the warm afternoon air, creating a vibrant atmosphere that Mrs. Bernard found unacceptable. As their laughter continued, her discontent grew, slowly transforming into frustration. She suddenly stood up, her silhouette illuminated by the sunlight filtering through the window. Ideas began to bubble in her mind, a sneaky impulse to restore order according to her vision. Then, an idea crossed her mind, a sly thought that slipped into her like a tempting whisper. Quietly, she made her way to her desk, her footsteps soft and silent in the dark hallway. When she reached her polished wooden desk, she slowly opened a drawer, as if afraid the slightest squeak would attract someone's attention. From the drawer, she pulled out a small packet of white powder she had been keeping for some time. This packet, carefully hidden beneath piles of unused paper, seemed to almost glow in the dimness, a secret that was both hidden and formidable. Mrs. Bernard hesitated for a moment, eyeing the powder with a mix of fear and determination. Her hands trembled slightly as she contemplated the implications of her action. A part of her whispered to abandon the idea, to simply turn away and let the boys play in peace. Yet, her irritation and desire for calm had taken over, transforming into an unyielding resolve. She shut the drawer with a sharp motion, as if sealing her decision, and took a deep breath to summon the courage she needed for what she was about to do. Slipping the packet into the pocket of her apron, she quietly exited through the back door of her house, glancing around furtively to make sure no one was watching. The garden behind her house, with its neatly trimmed hedges and impeccably maintained rose bushes, gave the impression of perfect tranquility, but Mrs. Bernard knew that every action she took here took on a completely different meaning. She walked along the side of the house, advancing silently on the gravel, her heart pounding louder and louder in her chest. She reached the corner of the park where the boys were playing unnoticed. Discreetly, she watched their movements, waiting for the right moment. Her hand slid into her pocket, her fingers closing around the packet as she considered where to place it to draw the attention of the authorities. In her mind, she already saw the neighbors' shocked and scandalized faces when they discovered the powder in the park. Perhaps, she thought, that would be enough to drive these young troublemakers out of the neighborhood and restore the tranquility she longed for. Meanwhile, Liam and Ethan, tired but happy from their afternoon of play, were about to leave. They were packing up their things with the carefree spirit of two 13-year-old boys, already discussing their next soccer game and the new moves they wanted to try. Their enthusiastic voices and laughter still filled the park, unaware of the plot unfolding so close to them. It was then that Mrs. Bernard, who had been watching them from her hiding spot, saw her chance. Seizing a moment when the boys turned their backs to her, she crept silently toward the bench where Liam's bag was placed. Her movements were precise and calculated, despite the slight tremor in her hands, betraying the anxiety that was slowly creeping in. Glancing around quickly to make sure no passerby or neighbor was in sight, she took a deep breath, then slipped the small packet into one of the side pockets of Liam's bag. The cold touch of the powder against the fabric made her realize the magnitude of her action, but it was too late to back out now. She placed the bag back as if nothing had happened and quickly slipped away, heading back to her house with a mix of satisfaction and nervousness. She walked briskly, almost hurriedly, feeling her heart race, the adrenaline blending with a faint sense of apprehension. As she moved away, she glanced over her shoulder to make sure no one was watching her. Once inside her house, Mrs. Bernard carefully closed the door behind her, taking a moment to enjoy the calm of the interior. Her heart still pounding from her bold move, she slipped behind the curtains of the living room window, discreetly parting them to observe the scene from a distance. Liam and Ethan were talking, carefree, completely unaware of the trap she had set for them. A thin, tight smile spread across her lips, a mixture of satisfaction and a fleeting worry that was quickly pushed aside. In her mind, she was already imagining the scene that would unfold, anticipating with bitter delight the scandal the discovery of the packet would cause in the neighborhood. Satisfied with her little scheme, Mrs. Bernard took her phone with a steady hand. She slowly dialed the police, her breathing steadying as her plan took shape. When someone answered, she adopted a grave and measured tone, trying to add a touch of credibility to her lie. "Yes, hello. I'd like to report suspicious activity in Rivetville Park," she said in a calm voice, though there was barely concealed satisfaction beneath it. "I believe I saw some young people exchanging drugs," she added, stressing the words young people and drugs to emphasize the urgency of the situation. The officer on the other end of the line asked her a few questions, to which Mrs. Bernard answered with precision, describing Liam and Ethan without mentioning their names. She claimed to have seen them several times loitering around the park, adding that she was concerned for the safety of the neighborhood. "With everything going on these days, one can never be too careful," she concluded in a falsely worried tone, insisting that swift action was needed. After hanging up, Mrs. Bernard placed her phone on the table and resumed her position behind the curtains, eagerly watching for what would happen next. She felt strangely euphoric, as if she had just pulled off a delicate operation. Her heart still raced, but it was a mixture of excitement and triumph. Shortly after, as the two friends were walking away from the park, joking with each other, the police sirens suddenly cut through the quiet afternoon air. Two police cars appeared at the park's entrance, their lights flashing, and stopped in a quick, determined maneuver. Officers stepped out with firm strides, their serious expressions in place. Liam and Ethan exchanged a look, concern slowly spreading across their faces. "Young man, stop. We need to search your bag," one of the officers ordered, staring at Liam with a penetrating gaze. Confused, not understanding why they were interested in him, Liam obeyed without resistance, his hands trembling. "I haven't done anything wrong," he murmured in a faint voice, his eyes searching for some understanding from the officers. But his backpack was already seized and opened with relentless efficiency. The officer's hands rummaged inside, and it didn't take long before he pulled out the small packet of white powder, holding it up as damning evidence. Liam's face crumbled at the sight of the packet, his eyes wide with terror and confusion. "Where did this come from?" the officer asked in a grave voice, his brows furrowing with suspicion. Liam shook his head, short of breath, unable to find the words to explain something he didn't even understand himself. Everything around him seemed to spin, as if the world suddenly lost all sense of logic. I don't know. It's not mine. I don't know how it got there," he stammered, his voice broken by panic. But the officers, indifferent to his confusion, exchanged meaningful glances, convinced they had caught a criminal. One of them grabbed Liam's wrists and, without further ado, cuffed him with a sharp motion. "We're taking you to the station, kid," the officer said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The coldness of his words sent a shiver down Liam's spine, and he felt the tears welling up despite himself. Ethan, meanwhile, stood frozen a few meters away, watching the scene unfold like a waking nightmare. His best friend, falsely accused, was handcuffed and taken away like a criminal. "This is a mistake. Liam didn't do anything," Ethan shouted desperately, stepping forward in an attempt to intervene. But the officers ignored him, gently but firmly pushing him aside, as though he were nothing more than an inconvenient witness. At that moment, neighbors, alerted by the sirens and commotion, began to gather around the scene. Whispers spread through the small crowd, some exchanging critical glances, others whispering among themselves. Mrs. Bernard, concealed behind her window, watched the scene with a satisfied smile, as if savoring the spectacle of her plan being executed flawlessly. Amid the commotion, Liam cast desperate glances around him, his eyes meeting those of a few neighbors he recognized. However, instead of finding empathy, he saw suspicion and hasty judgment in their faces. His heart tightened as he realized the full scope of what this accusation would mean for him. Helpless, Ethan watched the officers lead his friend toward the cars, his desperate calls echoing in vain. "You're wrong. He didn't do anything." But his voice was drowned out by the noise of the crowd and the indifference of the authorities. In a matter of minutes, the carefree afternoon of the two boys had turned into a nightmare, the kind of injustice that neither Liam nor Ethan had ever thought possible. Mrs. Bernard drew the curtains shut, her heart filled with satisfaction. In her mind, the peace of her neighborhood had been restored, and she no longer had to worry about those troubles she deemed undesirable. She saw her actions as a simple way to protect the neighborhood, unaware of the devastating consequences this accusation would have on Liam's life. The cars headed toward the police station, roaring over the rough pavement, their sirens wailing through the night. The tension was palpable inside the vehicles, each officer feeling the weight of what they were about to do. What none of them knew yet was that Liam's father, General Hugo Blackwell, was the head of the Rivettville Police Department. A man both respected and feared, known for his rigor and integrity, but also for his reputation of being uncompromising in the face of any breach of the law. When the cars crossed the police station gates, a heavy silence fell. The officers exchanged worried glances, aware that this case could quickly exceed their usual scope of responsibility. No sooner had the engines stopped than one of the officers received a radio call. "The general is at the station. He wants an immediate update on this case." The words rang like thunder in the fragile calm of the station. The officer frowned, not immediately understanding the gravity of the situation. A wave of apprehension spread through the room as everyone realized the stakes were much higher than they had imagined. Upon arriving at the station, Liam was led to an interrogation room. The space was stark, with gray walls and a harsh fluorescent light that only heightened his discomfort. The officers, although trained to handle all sorts of situations, seemed to hesitate. They were beginning to realize who the father of the boy sitting before them was, and this realization cast a shadow over their certainties. Whispers of hierarchy and the potential consequences of mishandling this young man made them think twice before making decisions. However, despite the growing anxiety, procedures were procedures. They had to treat Liam like any other suspect, regardless of his father's prominence. Liam sat, his wrists still handcuffed, fear flooding every fiber of his being. His heart raced, a frantic rhythm that made him feel as though everyone could hear it. Each look from the officers scrutinized him, analyzing not only his behavior but also his stature and posture, as if searching for signs of guilt where there were none. Thoughts swirled in his mind. What did I do to deserve this? Why am I being arrested? What will my father say? The feeling of injustice overwhelmed him. He was just a teenager, caught in a whirlwind of events beyond his control. As he focused on his breathing to calm himself, he glanced at the officers around him. Some seemed nervous, others, more determined, were preparing to begin the interrogation. The head of the unit, a man with stern features, finally spoke, his tone a mix of authority and caution. "Liam, we're going to ask you some questions about what happened. It's essential that you be honest with us." Liam nodded, his thoughts racing as he tried to summon his courage. The reality of his situation struck him. He wasn't just there as a boy, but as the son of a powerful man, a fact that could either grant him some relief or make his troubles even worse. As the questions started flying, Liam focused on his answers. But each word he spoke felt heavy with consequence, as if it weighed on a fragile scale that could tip at any moment. In that interrogation room, a young man's innocence was being tested, and Liam knew the outcome of that night could change the course of his life forever. A few minutes later, the door to the room opened abruptly, flooding the dim interrogation room with harsh light. A tall man with graying hair entered, his expression cold. It was General Blackwell, Liam's father, whose reputation preceded him, a man whose imposing stature and impeccable uniform commanded both respect and fear. His hard gaze betrayed no emotion, but inside, he was boiling with anger and worry. He stared for a moment at his son, observing his face marked by fear and confusion, before turning to the officers present in the room. "Explain to me what's going on here," he said in a firm and authoritative voice, each word resonating like a thunderclap. One of the officers stepped forward, uncomfortable, clearly shaken by the appearance of the general. "Sir, we found this packet of powder in your son's backpack. We received an anonymous tip about suspicious activity in the park." The officer's voice trembled slightly, betraying the nervousness he felt. General Blackwell, his features hardening, looked at the packet, then at his son, who stared back at him with tears in his eyes, palpable distress in his gaze. "Dad, I swear I don't know where that came from." Liam trembled with fear, fully aware of the gravity of the situation and the threat posed by such an accusation. The reality of the moment hit him like a punch. He had never faced anything so terrifying. The general slowly turned toward his officers, the weight of his authority filling the room. "Who made the call? And do you have any solid evidence other than this packet to accuse my son?" The tension was palpable, each exchanged glance between the officers revealing growing nervousness.
"No, sir."
The call came from a woman in the neighborhood, but we haven't confirmed her identity yet, the officer replied, visibly nervous, realizing that his response was only escalating the situation. The general straightened, anger and determination burning in his eyes. "I know my son. He has never touched drugs. I want a thorough and swift investigation into this matter. And in the meantime, I want Liam released immediately." His voice was firm, almost threatening, and the officers hesitated for a moment, but General Blackwell was not a man to be contradicted. They reluctantly complied, releasing Liam from his handcuffs, which fell to the floor with a dull thud, as if symbolizing the pain this situation had inflicted. Liam, still in shock with his heart racing, rushed toward his father. "I don't understand, Dad. Who would do this to me?" Anxiety was choking him, and he desperately searched for answers, trying to understand how he had ended up in such a situation. The general placed a comforting hand on his son's shoulder, a soothing gesture amidst the storm. "I'll find out, my boy. And when I do, they'll pay for what they've done." His voice was softer, almost paternal, but a determined glint shone in his eyes. He knew it wouldn't be easy, that the shadow of the accusation might always linger over them, but he was ready to fight to defend his son. He turned to the officers, undeniable authority emanating from him. "I expect your report as soon as possible. I will hold you accountable for every step of this investigation. No one tarnishes the Blackwell name without facing consequences." The officers, although having released Liam, knew that the general was not a man who easily forgave mistakes. The atmosphere was now charged with tension, and the shadow of uncertainty loomed over Liam's future as the general, with the force of his authority, prepared to face the battle ahead. The next morning, at the police station, General Blackwell summoned his best investigator, Inspector Jenkins. He was a meticulous man, known for solving the most complex cases. The general briefly explained the situation: an anonymous call leading to his son's arrest, and a drug packet found in Liam's bag. "I want you to find the person who made that call. Use any means necessary," the general ordered, determination unwavering in his eyes. Jenkins nodded. He knew this case was far from ordinary, but he already had a lead. He returned to his office, determined to track down the responsible party. By analyzing the phone records for calls received by the police switchboard, he managed to identify the number from which the anonymous call had been made. It was a landline located in the residential area where Liam had been arrested. After checking the addresses associated with the number, Jenkins discovered that the call had been made from Mrs. Bernard's house. Without wasting any time, he went to the location with a team of 2 other officers. Mrs. Bernard, appearing calm and innocent, greeted them with a tense smile at her door. "How can I help you, gentlemen?" she asked in a soft but strained voice. Inspector Jenkins showed her his badge. "Mrs. Bernard, we are investigating an anonymous call made yesterday from this house. We have reason to believe that this call might be linked to a false accusation. Can you explain why a call was made from your line?" Mrs. Bernard's face paled slightly. She tried to hide her discomfort. "A call? I don't know what you're talking about. I haven't done anything wrong." "Perhaps you're mistaken." Jenkins, impassive, replied, "Ma'am, we have evidence that the call came from your home. We need to check your phone line and ask you a few questions." She hesitated, then allowed them to enter. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Jenkins and his team discreetly scanned every corner of the house while questioning Mrs. Bernard. They sought to understand her motivations, although nothing seemed suspicious at first glance. Yet Jenkins could sense that something was off. After a few minutes of conversation, Mrs. Bernard began to feel cornered. The investigator could perceive her growing anxiety. He then asked the question that shifted the situation. "Why did you call the police to report Liam, Mrs. Bernard? What were you hoping to accomplish?" Mrs. Bernard's mask cracked. She began to stutter, trying to justify her actions. I didn't want the neighborhood to be taken over by criminals. This boy, he was making too much noise with his friend. I didn't think it would go this far. I just wanted to restore order." Jenkins furrowed his brow, realizing how premeditated her actions had been. "You slipped that packet of drugs into Liam's bag, didn't you?" Mrs. Bernard, disoriented, lowered her head, unable to respond. At that moment, she understood that her plan had failed and that she had put an innocent person in danger. She finally murmured, almost in tears, "I didn't want it to go this far. I just wanted them to stop coming here, to disturb the peace of the neighborhood." Inspector Jenkins exchanged a glance with his colleagues before addressing Mrs. Bernard in a firm tone. "What you've done is serious, Mrs. Bernard. Not only did you make a false statement, but you also attempted to incriminate an innocent child. You will have to answer for your actions." She was arrested on the spot and taken to the police station. When General Blackwell learned the news, he felt a mixture of relief and anger. He had proof that his son was innocent, but he also knew that justice would not forgive those who tried to harm his child. Liam, still affected by the incident, silently looked at his father. "You told me we'd find the truth, Dad." The general placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder. "And that's what we've done. But remember, there will always be malicious people, Liam. What matters is staying strong and always believing in the truth." As for Mrs. Bernard, she faced the consequences of her actions, realizing that a simple attempt to harm innocent children could turn into a personal tragedy she hadn't anticipated. While Mrs. Bernard was in custody, Inspector Jenkins continued his investigation. He knew something was wrong with this woman's story. Mrs. Bernard's nervous behavior, her clumsy justification, everything left him puzzled. After interrogating her, he ordered a thorough search of her house, suspecting there was more than just a neighborhood quarrel behind her actions. The agents searched the house from top to bottom, and soon, a shocking discovery surfaced. Hidden in a secret compartment under the living room floor, they found several packets of white powder, identical to the one placed in Liam's bag. There were also bundles of bills neatly stored and suspicious documents that seemed to indicate illicit transactions. Jenkins, stunned, reviewed the evidence. Mrs. Bernard, an elderly neighbor, was actually involved in a large drug trafficking network. The inspector immediately reported this information to General Blackwell. Mrs. Bernard, cornered by the irrefutable evidence, eventually confessed during her second interrogation. Behind her appearance as a respectable citizen, She had been secretly managing a drug distribution network for several years. She had amassed a small fortune selling cocaine and other substances in the city, but her operation had remained under the radar of local authorities due to her discretion. That day, when she saw Liam and Ethan playing in the park, she panicked. She feared their presence would attract too much attention to her neighborhood and jeopardize her illegal activities. That's why she set up the trap to frame Liam, hoping to divert suspicion from her own actions. When the truth came out, General Blackwell felt a mix of rage and relief. He had prepared himself for a legal battle to defend his son's innocence, but he never expected to uncover a criminal network right under their noses. Mrs. Bernard was charged with drug trafficking, false testimony, and attempting to frame a minor. The local press quickly reported the case, shocking the residents of Rivetville, who could never have imagined that such an apparently innocent person was behind a criminal network. As for Liam, although relieved to have been cleared, he remained haunted by the event. "It's crazy to think someone like her could be so dangerous," he said to his father one evening. General Blackwell nodded gravely. "Danger doesn't always look the way we expect. But you've learned an important lesson, Liam. Always fight for the truth, even when everything seems against you." The case of Mrs. Bernard, now known as the White Widow of Rivetville, left an indelible mark on the town's history, but it also allowed the police to dismantle a drug trafficking network much larger than they had imagined. And so, dear listeners, this story reminds us that the truth always prevails, no matter the obstacles. Behind the most ordinary appearances, like that of Mrs. Bernard, there can lie a dark reality. But thanks to General Blackwell's determination and Inspector Jenkins' hard work, the truth came to light, and an innocent was saved. This story teaches us that justice, although it may be slow and fraught with obstacles, always finds its way. Stay vigilant, keep faith in the truth, and remember that evil can take many forms, even the most unexpected.